Two flashlight beams cut through absolute darkness, 400 feet beneath the Earth's surface. The air in the sunken Sparrow mine tasted of rust and rot, thick with the centuries-old breath of collapsed tunnels and forgotten industry. Jake Hernandez and Mia Chen had come here for photographs, for the thrill of trespassing into history, for content that would make their urban exploration channel stand out. What they found instead was a sound that shouldn't exist. A voice. Weak, hoarse, barely human, but unmistakably calling for help from somewhere deeper in the network of shafts. They would later tell investigators they almost convinced themselves it was wind moving through the tunnels, an auditory hallucination born from fear and bad air. But then they heard it again, clearer this time, forming words. "Please, someone, please." When their lights finally found him, huddled against the stone wall of a collapsed chamber, they didn't recognize him as human at first. The figure was skeletal, clothing hanging from bones, face obscured by matted hair and 9 months of filth. But he was alive, conscious, and according to every expert who would later review the case, he should have been dead 7 months ago. This is Ethan Hayes, geologist, experienced outdoorsman, the man who vanished into the Serpent's Backbone Wilderness on October 12, 2022, and was officially declared deceased after the most extensive search operation in the county's history found absolutely nothing. The man who, on July 3, 2023, 274 days after he disappeared, was discovered over a mile deep in an abandoned mine that wasn't on his route, miles from any marked trail. The man who, despite conditions that should have killed him within weeks, survived. And who insists, to this day, that he wasn't alone down there. Ethan Michael Hayes was not supposed to become a cautionary tale. At 32, he had spent nearly a decade working as a contract geologist for mining survey companies across the American Southwest, a profession that demanded intimate knowledge of exactly the kind of terrain that would eventually swallow him whole. His colleagues described him as methodical to the point of obsession, the type who triple-checked equipment lists, who studied topographic maps until he could navigate them in his sleep, who treated wilderness preparation not as paranoia, but as basic professional competence. His apartment, later searched by investigators, revealed notebooks filled with meticulous route plans, geological sketches, and coordinates cross-referenced with historical mining records. His gear closet contained equipment organized by category and function, first aid supplies inspected and rotated according to expiration dates, navigation tools with fresh batteries in labeled containers, satellite, communicator charged and tested monthly. Friends told detectives that Ethan had once turned back from a camping trip because he realized he'd forgotten a backup fire starter, even though he had 3 other methods of making fire in his pack. This context makes his final trip particularly disturbing, because someone with Ethan's training and temperament doesn't simply vanish. On October 10, 2022, Ethan submitted a 3-day leave request to his current employer, citing personal project work. He informed his brother, Daniel Hayes, that he would be surveying and photographing geological formations in the Serpent's Backbone Wilderness, a 200-square-mile expanse of high desert terrain along the Arizona-New Mexico border. He provided a detailed itinerary. Entry point at the Copper Ridge Trailhead, planned route following the Eastern Canyon system, expected return on October 14th by 6 p.m. He included GPS coordinates for each day's planned camp location, but he also included a qualifier, handwritten at the bottom of the printed itinerary. May deviate for interesting rock strata. Will mark deviations on GPS tracker. On October 12th at 2:47 p.m., Ethan sent his last communication, a text message to Daniel accompanied by a photograph. The image showed a distinctive spire of striated sandstone, its layers twisted into an unusual formation that suggested significant geological upheaval. The caption read, "Found something interesting off the main route. Going dark for a bit to get detailed survey. Back on schedule by tomorrow night." The photograph's metadata contained GPS coordinates that placed Ethan approximately 4 miles southeast of his planned route, in a section of wilderness known primarily for its density of abandoned mine shafts. 19th century prospectors had honeycombed this area with exploratory tunnels, chasing silver and copper veins that rarely justified the investment. Most of these mines had been forgotten for over a century, their entrances collapsed or hidden by erosion and vegetation. When Ethan failed to return by October the 14th, Daniel waited until the morning of October 15th before contacting authorities, following his brother's explicit instructions. "Don't worry unless I'm 12 hours overdue. I'm always careful, but I also like my solitude." Coconino County Sheriff's deputies found Ethan's vehicle, a 2019 Toyota 4Runner, at the Copper Ridge Trailhead at 11:20 a.m. on October 15th. The truck was locked. Nothing appeared disturbed. His keys were later found in his brother's possession. Ethan had left them there deliberately, carrying only a spare for the vehicle's lockbox. The search began immediately. The Serpent's Backbone. Wilderness earned its name from the way its canyon system curves and branches across the high desert plateau. A maze of arroyos and stone corridors that, from aerial perspective, resembles the skeletal remains of some massive reptile pressed into the earth. The landscape operates according to rules that seem designed to disorient. Canyons that appear to lead somewhere simply end at vertical walls. GPS signals bounce unreliably off stone surfaces. Landmarks that seem distinctive from ground level become indistinguishable from a dozen identical formations when viewed from another angle. The region sits at approximately 5,800 feet elevation, high enough that October nights drop below freezing, low enough that midday sun can push temperatures into the 80s. Vegetation is sparse: juniper, pinyon pine, hardy shrubs adapted to drought. Water is scarce, limited to seasonal streams that run only after rain and a handful of springs that local wildlife depends on for survival. The geological history is written in the stone. Ancient seabeds lifted and fractured by tectonic forces, volcanic intrusions that created mineral deposits, millions of years of erosion, carving channels through weakness. Between 1870 and 1910, mining companies drove over 200 exploratory shafts into this landscape. Most were shallow, abandoned within months when ore quality proved insufficient. Perhaps 30 descended more than 100 feet. A dozen went deep, following veins into the mountain's interior, creating networks of tunnels that were never formally mapped. When silver prices collapsed and copper became easier to extract elsewhere, the companies simply left. Equipment was salvaged. Entrances were sometimes dynamited to prevent access, and the mines were forgotten. Over a century later, many of these entrances are invisible, covered by rockfall, hidden behind vegetation, eroded into depressions that look like natural features rather than human excavation. The maps that did exist, hand-drawn surveys from mine engineers, are scattered across historical archives, incomplete and frequently inaccurate. Modern topographic maps mark perhaps 20% of the actual mine locations. This was the terrain that swallowed Ethan Hayes. Search and rescue operations officially commenced at 1 p.m. on October the 15th, 2022. The initial response involved 12 SAR personnel from Coconino County, operating on the assumption that Ethan was injured but alive, possibly sheltering in place. Search parameters were established using his planned route and the GPS coordinates from his final photograph. Teams swept a 5-mile radius, calling his name, watching for signals, checking every canyon branch and sheltered overhang. By October 16th, the search had expanded to include a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging, 2 additional SAR teams from neighboring counties, and 4 canine units specializing in wilderness tracking. Dogs were given Ethan's scent from clothing provided by his brother. The helicopter flew grid patterns at varying altitudes, thermal cameras scanning for the heat signature of a human body. They found nothing. October the 17th brought drones equipped with high-resolution cameras, capable of examining terrain features inaccessible to ground teams. Volunteers, fellow geologists, hiking club members, former colleagues arrived to assist with ground searches. The effort expanded to a 50-square-mile search area. Teams checked every abandoned mine entrance they could locate, calling into dark openings, listening for responses. Silence. By October 20th, over 60 people were involved in active searching. By October 25th, the search area had expanded to 75 square miles. Investigators interviewed everyone Ethan had contacted in the weeks before his trip, looking for any indication of his plans, any mention of specific locations he wanted to visit. They examined his computer, his phone records, his notebook, entries. They found route plans and geological surveys, but nothing that explained where he had gone. The last active search was conducted on November the 4th, 2022. 3 weeks of intensive effort involving hundreds of personnel hours, thousands of miles covered on foot and by air, dozens of abandoned mine entrances investigated. Not a single piece of evidence was recovered. No dropped equipment, no footprints preserved in mud, no fabric caught on branches. The wilderness had absorbed Ethan Hayes completely, leaving behind not even traces. On November 18th, 2022, the official search was suspended. On February 10th, 2023, after the legally required waiting period and with no new evidence, Ethan Michael Hayes was declared legally deceased. Cause unknown. Body unrecovered. His case file was transferred to archives. His family held a memorial service with an empty casket. The hiking forums and geology communities posted tributes. Another name added to the list of those who went into the wilderness and never returned. For 9 months, that's where the story ended. After 32 days, the official search was suspended. The announcement came on November 19th, 2022, delivered by the Serpent's Backbone Wilderness incident commander during a brief press conference held at the ranger station parking lot. The language was careful, bureaucratic, designed to soften what everyone already understood. Ethan Hayes was gone. The term used in the official report was presumed deceased, not dead, not confirmed, but a purgatory designation that allowed the case to shift from rescue operation to recovery file. The helicopters stopped flying their grid patterns. The SAR teams packed their equipment and returned to their regular posts across 3 states. The canine units went home. The communication center that had hummed with radio chatter for weeks went silent. Within 48 hours, the only presence remaining in the wilderness was the same it had always been: rock, wind, and the indifferent patience of geologic time. Ethan's family refused to accept it. His mother, Janet Hayes, released a statement through a local news outlet on November 23rd. The text was brief but defiant. Ethan is not gone. He knows these environments better than most professionals. He has training, intelligence, and the will to survive. We are not giving up, and we ask that you don't either. She organized volunteer search parties, groups of civilians, some experienced hikers, others just concerned strangers who had followed the case online. They went out every weekend through late November and into December, walking trails that had already been walked, calling Ethan's name into canyons that had already been searched. They found nothing. Winter arrived. The first snow fell on December the 8th, blanketing the high ridges of the Serpent's Backbone in white. Temperatures dropped below freezing at night, and even the most optimistic volunteers understood what that meant. If Ethan had somehow survived the initial weeks, the cold would finish what the wilderness had started. The volunteer searches stopped. The social media posts from friends and family became less frequent, shifting from urgent pleas for information to memorial reflections, shared photos of Ethan smiling on past hikes, tributes to a man spoken of increasingly in the past tense. The case became a file. By January 2023, Ethan Hayes was no longer front-page news. His disappearance was absorbed into the statistical background of the American wilderness, one of approximately 1,600 people reported missing in the national parks and forests each year, and one of the roughly 15% who are never found. Local hiking forums mentioned his name as a cautionary tale. Trail guides updated their safety warnings with oblique references to recent disappearances. Rangers used his case in briefings about the importance of staying on marked paths. The world moved on. Spring came. Snowmelt swelled the creeks running through the Serpent's Backbone, carving temporary waterfalls down. Canyon walls. Wildflowers bloomed in the meadows where search helicopters had once hovered. Hikers returned to the trails, passing within miles of where Ethan had last been seen, unaware they were walking through the scene of an unsolved mystery. Janet Hayes marked Ethan's 33rd birthday on April 14th with a post on the Find Ethan Hayes Facebook page, which still had over 12,000 followers, though engagement had dwindled. "He should be here," she wrote. "He should be blowing out candles and complaining about getting older and planning his next trip. Instead, we're left with silence." The comments were sympathetic but sparse. The page had become a memorial. By summer, even the family had begun to speak differently. Not in terms of when Ethan would be found, but if. The psychological shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Hope curdling slowly into resignation. His father mentioned, in a June interview with a regional magazine, that they were considering a memorial service. Not a funeral, he clarified. They had no body, but something to acknowledge the loss, to give friends and family a space to grieve. 9 months passed. 9 months in which the Serpent's Backbone wilderness held its secret. 9 months in which rain fell and evaporated, in which animals moved through the canyons and left tracks that washed away, in which the abandoned mines that pocked the region sat in their familiar darkness, silent and undisturbed. 9 months in which Ethan Hayes existed only as a name in a database, a photograph on a missing person's website, a story that people half remembered when the subject of wilderness safety came up. The case was cold. The file was closed. The man was gone. Until July 22nd, 2023, when 2 amateur explorers descended into a mine that wasn't supposed to exist and heard a voice that shouldn't have been possible. The Sunken Sparrow Mine does not appear on any official park map. It sits approximately 4 miles northwest of Ethan Hayes' last known position, accessed only by scrambling through a narrow ravine choked with deadfall and poison oak, then climbing down a 15-foot rock face into a depression hidden beneath a canopy of pines. The entrance is a vertical shaft, partially collapsed, reinforced by rotting timbers that date back to the 1880s. Silver boom. Local cavers knew about it, but barely. It had a reputation for instability, bad air, and nothing worth the risk. On July 22nd, 2023, at approximately 2:40 p.m., 2 men entered it anyway. Derek Milhouse, 29, and Connor Voss, 26, ran a small YouTube channel documenting abandoned places, old factories, forgotten railways, derelict mines. Their content averaged a few thousand views per video. They had been exploring the Serpent's Backbone region for 3 days, camping illegally and hiking off trail to reach sites marked in a decades-old mining survey they'd purchased from a historical society. The Sunken Sparrow was on that survey, listed as partially active until 1891. Presumed collapsed. They brought standard gear, headlamps, backup flashlights, rope, a handheld gas detector to check for carbon monoxide and methane, helmets, first aid supplies, and 2 handheld radios in case they got separated. Connor carried a GoPro camera mounted to his chest. The footage from that camera would later be reviewed by investigators, paramedics, and mine safety experts. It would also be sealed from public release. The descent took 40 minutes. The main shaft dropped nearly vertical for the first 60 feet before leveling into a lateral tunnel that sloped gradually downward. The air was cool, damp, and stale, but the gas detector registered safe levels. The tunnel branched multiple times, some passages blocked by cave-ins, others narrowing into crawl spaces they chose not to attempt. They moved deeper, marking They're wrote with spray paint on the walls, following the largest tunnel. At approximately 3:20 p.m., they reached a chamber. It was wider than the tunnel, perhaps 20 feet across, with a low ceiling supported by old timber bracing. On the far side, a shallow pool of water reflected their headlamp beams. Groundwater seeping through a fissure in the rock. The pool was clear, cold and still. Derek later told investigators it was the cleanest water he'd seen in any mine. Then Connor heard the sound. He described it in his 911 call as a voice, but not like talking. More like breathing shaped into words. He thought it was wind moving through a shaft. Derek thought it was an animal. They stood still, listening. The sound came again, from the far side of the chamber, beyond the pool. In the shadows their lights hadn't yet reached. Help! Connor's GoPro footage shows the moment both men turned their headlamps toward the sound. The beam swept across the chamber, over the pool, and caught something against the far wall. A shape, hunched, draped in filthy, ragged cloth. Derek shouted. Connor stumbled backward, colliding with the tunnel wall. The shape didn't move. For several seconds, neither did the men. The audio from the GoPro captured their breathing, short, panicked gasps, and then Derek's voice, shaking. "Is that a person?" They approached slowly. The figure was seated with its back against the rock, legs pulled to its chest, head down. It wore what might have once been a jacket, now shredded and black with grime. Its hands were skeletal, fingers wrapped around its knees. The skin was gray, stretched tight over bone. Hair hung in matted clumps. The smell, both men later reported, was overpowering. A mixture of sweat, decay, and something else they couldn't identify. Connor whispered, "I think he's dead." Then the head lifted. Two eyes, sunken deep in their sockets, caught the light. The mouth opened, lips cracked and bleeding, and the voice came again, barely audible. "Water." Derek Millhouse later told paramedics he had never heard a sound more terrible, not because it was loud or monstrous, but because it was so unmistakably human, and so wrong to hear it in that place. Connor fumbled for his radio and ran back towards the entrance tunnel, shouting into it despite knowing there was no signal a mile underground. Derek stayed, hands shaking, and unscrewed the cap from his water bottle. He stepped forward, knelt, and held it out. The skeletal hands reached for it, trembling violently but couldn't grip. Derek had to press the bottle to the man's lips and tip it slowly. The man drank, choked, drank again. Derek asked, "Who are you?" The man's eyes focused. Barely. His voice was a rasp. "Ethan." The extraction operation began at 5:47 p.m. after Connor had run back to the surface, driven 4 miles to the nearest location with cell signal, and called 911. The dispatcher initially struggled to understand his report. A missing hiker from 9 months ago, found alive, over a mile underground. She flagged it as a possible hoax until Connor provided GPS coordinates and his own identification. A specialized mine rescue team from the State Emergency Services Division was dispatched, along with paramedics trained in confined space medicine. They reached the site at 7:15 p.m. and began the descent with a collapsible stretcher, oxygen, IV fluids, and thermal blankets. They reached Ethan at 8:40 p.m. The lead paramedic, whose report was later filed with the incident documentation, noted that the patient was semi-conscious, severely emaciated, and hypothermic despite the mild air temperature. Estimated body weight, 130 pounds, down from a pre-disappearance weight of approximately 210. Muscle atrophy was extreme. Skin showed signs of severe vitamin D deficiency and multiple infected abrasions. He was able to respond to questions but disoriented regarding time and date. They secured him to the stretcher, started an IV, and began the ascent. It took 8 hours. The tunnel was too narrow in places to carry the stretcher horizontally. Sections had to be cleared of debris. Twice they stopped because Ethan's breathing became labored, and they had to administer oxygen. At one point, according to the paramedics' notes, he became agitated, trying to sit up despite restraints. and began speaking rapidly in a hoarse whisper. The paramedic leaned close to hear. Ethan grabbed his arm, fingers digging in with unexpected strength. "You have to go back for him." The paramedic assumed a delirium. He asked, "Go back for who?" Ethan's eyes were wide, wet with tears. "Silas. He showed me the water. He's still down there." The ambulance bay doors at San Rafael Regional Medical Center slammed open at 11:47 p.m. on March 14th, 2024. What arrived wasn't a rescue, it was a resurrection. Dr. Sarah Chen had 22 years of emergency medicine experience. She treated everything from multi-vehicle accidents to severe burns to hypothermia cases pulled from winter storms. When the paramedics wheeled in the stretcher from the sunken Sparrow Mine extraction, she later testified that her first assumption was they'd brought her a corpse. The man on the gurney weighed 142 pounds. His medical history, pulled from county records during the initial search 9 months earlier, listed his baseline weight at 224 pounds. He had lost 82 pounds, more than a third of his body mass. His skin hung loose over a skeletal frame. Every rib was visible. His cheekbones jutted at angles that cast shadows across his face, even under the harsh fluorescent examination lights. His eyes had retreated deep into their sockets. His hair, which his driver's license showed as dark brown, had gone completely white, but he was conscious. Dr. Chen's preliminary examination notes, filed at 12:03 a.m., documented findings that should have been impossible. Core body temperature, 94.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Hypothermic, but not critically so, given 9 months underground. Blood pressure, 88/54. Dangerously low, but functional. Heart rate, 52 beats per minute. Bradycardic, yet steady. The blood panel told a more disturbing story. Severe hypoalbuminemia indicated chronic protein deficiency. His albumin levels measured 2.1 grams per deciliter. Normal range begins at 3.4. Vitamin D was undetectable. Vitamin B12 measured at 112 picograms per milliliter, well below the 200 threshold for deficiency. His potassium sat at 2.9 milliequivalents per liter, teetering on the edge of dangerous cardiac dysfunction. His muscle mass had cannibalized itself. The CT scan showed advanced sarcopenia, muscle atrophy, typically seen in bedridden elderly patients or late-stage wasting diseases. His quadriceps measured 40%, smaller than normal for a man of his former build. His calf muscles had diminished, to the point where the tibia and fibula were clearly visible through the skin. Dr. Chen consulted with Dr. Marcus Webb, the hospital's lead nutritionist, at 1:15 a.m. Webb reviewed the labs in silence for nearly 3 minutes before speaking. "This is a starvation profile," he said. "Advanced. I'm seeing ketone levels that indicate his body has been burning its own tissue for months. But here's what doesn't make sense. He should be in multi-organ failure. His kidney function is compromised but still working. His liver enzymes are elevated, but not catastrophic. His heart is weak but beating. By every metric we have, he should have died weeks ago." The refeeding protocol began immediately. IV fluids, electrolyte correction, small amounts of easily digestible nutrients administered in carefully timed intervals. Refeeding syndrome, a potentially fatal complication when nutrition is reintroduced too quickly to a starved body, was the primary concern. But Ethan Hayes remained conscious through it all, delirious at times, yes, confused about where he was, certainly, but aware. Physical therapist Nicole Carr was brought in on the second day to assess his mobility. Her report, filed March 16th, noted that he could not stand unassisted. His leg muscles had atrophied to the point where they could not support his diminished weight. He had pressure ulcers on his heels, his tailbone, and his left shoulder blade, wounds consistent with prolonged periods lying on stone. Yet somehow, he had crawled or dragged himself to the underground pool the explorers found him near. The mine rescue team confirmed he was found approximately 200 yards from the nearest identified water source, though that distance included navigating through collapsed passages and over debris fields. Dr. Webb requested a Consultation with Dr. Amanda Price, a specialist in extreme survival cases from the University of Colorado. She arrived on the March 18th and spent 2 days reviewing every aspect of Ethan's condition. Her written assessment, submitted to the hospital and later to investigators, raised more questions than it answered. Patient presence with malnutrition profile consistent with approximately 180 to 240 days of severe caloric restriction, she wrote. However, survival for this duration, without any caloric intake, is not physiologically possible. The human body, even in a state of extreme metabolic slowdown, requires a baseline of approximately 1,200 to 1,500 calories daily to maintain organ function. Patient would have needed a minimum of 216,000 calories over 9 months to remain alive, even in a completely sedentary state. She continued, the presence of detectable muscle mass, functional cognition, and continued organ operation suggests patient had access to some form of nutrition. Water alone cannot account for survival of this duration. Absence of scurvy indicates vitamin C intake. Minimal bone density loss suggests some calcium and vitamin D, though levels indicate deprivation. Patient required calories from protein, carbohydrates, or fats. Source unknown. The fungi became the focus. Ethan, during his more lucid moments, kept repeating the same details. Silas brought him mushrooms, small ones, pale gray, growing in clusters near moisture. He ate them raw. Sometimes Silas brought him water in a container Ethan described as an old tin cup, dented with a wire handle. A mycologist from the Colorado School of Mines, Dr. Raymond Foster, was brought in to analyze samples collected from the mine. The rescue team had bagged specimens from multiple locations, including near where Ethan was found. Dr. Foster's report, dated March 22nd, identified 3 species of fungi present in the Sunken Sparrow Mine's depths. 2 were inedible, toxic enough to cause severe gastrointestinal distress. The third was Pleurotus dryanis, an oyster mushroom variant that grows on decaying wood and is technically edible, though rare at that depth and in those conditions. Caloric value of P. dryanis is approximately 33 calories per 100 grams raw weight, Dr. Foster wrote. To sustain minimal human function, patient would need to consume approximately 3 to 4 kilograms daily. This volume of fungi was not present in the areas examined. Regrowth rates in subterranean environments with limited airflow would not support sustained harvesting at this level. The mathematics didn't work. The water made sense. The underground spring could sustain him indefinitely. But the calories necessary to keep a human being alive for 274 days could not be accounted for by the sparse fungi found in the mine. On March 20th, during a cognitive assessment, Ethan was asked directly, "What did you eat?" His answer, recorded by the attending psychiatrist, Dr. Linda Voss, was consistent with every previous telling. Silas brought me mushrooms, and something else sometimes. It looked like jerky, maybe. Dark, dried. I didn't ask what it was. I was too hungry to ask. No evidence of jerky, dried meat, or any other food source was found in the mine. No wrappers, no scraps, no bones. Dr. Chen's final medical summary, compiled on March 25th before Ethan's transfer to a rehabilitation facility, included a single underlined sentence that appeared nowhere else in the hundreds of pages of documentation. Patient survival under described conditions is medically implausible without external nutritional intervention from an unidentified source. Ethan Hayes should have died in that mine. The fact that he didn't meant something kept him alive. The psychiatric evaluation began on March 17th, 2024, 3 days after Ethan's rescue. Dr. Linda Voss, a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma and dissociative disorders, was assigned to assess his mental state before investigators could take a formal statement. Her first session notes described a patient who was physically destroyed, but mentally coherent. Ethan answered questions with clarity. He knew his name, his age, so the year, the president. He understood he'd been rescued. He understood he'd been missing for 9 months. But when asked what happened in the mine, he didn't hesitate. He didn't search for words or show the confusion typical of trauma-induced memory gaps. He told her about Silas. "I fell," Ethan said, his voice still weak but steady. "I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I woke up, my leg was broken. Compound fracture, I think. I could see bone. My headlamp was gone. My pack was gone. I had my phone, but no signal, and the battery died after 2 days. I used the light while I had it. The tunnel I fell into wasn't on any map I'd ever seen." Dr. Voss's notes indicated she'd let him speak without interruption. "I tried to climb out the first week. Couldn't. The shaft was too vertical, and my leg was useless. I set it myself, best I could, using my belt and some pieces of timber I found. I thought I was going to die there. I accepted it, actually. Started rationing the water I found dripping from the ceiling. Stopped moving to conserve energy." He paused. Dr. Voss noted he looked directly at her when he continued. "Then he showed up." Ethan described the first encounter in the detail that never wavered across multiple retellings. It was night, or what he assumed was night, since his circadian rhythm had already begun to dissolve. He woke to the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from somewhere deeper in the tunnel. "I thought I was hallucinating," Ethan said, "but then I saw the light. Not electric. A candle, I think, or maybe a lantern, flickering. And then I saw him." Silas, according to Ethan, was an old man, 70, maybe older, though it was hard to tell in the dim light. He was thin but not emaciated, wiry, like someone whose body had adapted to deprivation rather than succumb to it. He wore layered clothing, all of it filthy and patched. A heavy canvas coat over what might have been a wool shirt, pants held up with rope, boots so worn the soles were separating from the leather. His hair was long, gray, matted. His beard reached mid-chest. His face was deeply lined, weathered in a way that suggested decades, not years. He didn't say anything at first, Ethan recalled. Just stood there, maybe 20 feet away, holding the light. I tried to speak, but my voice didn't work right. I managed to say, "Help," I think. He came closer, looked at my leg, looked at me. Then he turned around and left. Dr. Voss asked if he thought the man would return. "I didn't know," Ethan said. "I thought I'd imagined it. But the next day, or what I assumed was the next day, he came back. He had a tin cup filled with water, clean water, cold, and a handful of mushrooms. The visits became routine. Silas would appear every few days, always with water, usually with fungi. Sometimes he brought clusters of pale gray mushrooms. Other times, darker ones that tasted faintly of earth and rot. And occasionally, Ethan said, Silas brought something else. It looked like dried meat, Ethan told Dr. Voss. Jerky, maybe. Dark, tough, salty. I didn't ask what it was. I ate it. Silas never explained where the food came from. He rarely spoke at all. When he did, his voice was hoarse, his words clipped, as though language had atrophied from disuse. Ethan's Jishu included specific fragments of dialogue, recorded in Dr. Voss's notes. Silas told me, "Water runs east." That's how I knew which way to go when I was strong enough to move. Once I asked him how long he'd been down here. He said, "Long enough to forget the sky." I asked him why he didn't leave. He said, "Nothing up there for me." Ethan described Silas as cautious, almost feral. He never let Ethan see where he came from or where he went. He would arrive from one direction, deliver food or water, and disappear down a different passage. He refused to let Ethan follow him. "I tried once," Ethan said. "After my leg started healing, I waited until he left, then followed the sound of his footsteps. He knew. He came back, blocked my path, and just shook his head. Didn't say a word. I didn't try again." Dr. Voss asked why he thought Silas helped him. Ethan hesitated for the first time. "I don't know. Loneliness, maybe. Or habit, like feeding a stray dog." He didn't seem to want conversation, but he kept me alive. The timeline Ethan provided was consistent. Silas appeared approximately every 3 to 4 days for the first 2 months. Then the visits became less frequent. Sometimes a week would pass, occasionally longer. Ethan said he learned to ration whatever Silas brought, stretching the mushrooms and water across the gaps. There was one stretch where he didn't come for almost 2 weeks. Ethan said, "I thought he'd died, or decided I wasn't worth the effort anymore. I got weak, really weak. I couldn't move much. Then he showed up with more food than usual. He didn't explain, just left it and disappeared again." Dr. Voss's notes flagged several details for follow-up. Ethan's descriptions were remarkably specific for someone who claimed to have spent months in near total darkness. He described the texture of Silas's coat, heavy canvas like a miner's duster with bone buttons. He described the tin cup, dented on one side, with a wire handle wrapped in cloth. He described Silas's hands, scarred, with thick calluses, nails cracked and black. When asked how he could see these details in the dark, Ethan explained that Silas always carried the light source, and he'd had months to observe him. Investigators requested permission to interview Ethan on March 21st. Detective Sarah Kern and Sergeant Mike Holloway from the county sheriff's office sat across from him in his hospital room, a recording device on the table between them. Their questions were direct. Had Silas ever mentioned his full name? No. Where he came from? No. Why he was in the mine? Only that he'd been there a long time. Whether there were others? Silas never mentioned anyone else. Did he ever threaten you? Detective Kern asked. No, Ethan said. Did he ever restrain you or prevent you from leaving? I couldn't leave, Ethan said. My leg was broken. Even after it healed enough to walk, I was lost. I didn't know the way out. Silas knew the tunnels. I didn't. Did you ever ask him to lead you out? Ethan looked down at his hands. Yes. Once. About 4 months in, I think. I told him I needed to go home. He said the tunnels were too dangerous. Said I'd die in a collapse or fall into a shaft. He said he'd think about it. And? He never mentioned it again. The interview lasted 90 minutes. Ethan never contradicted himself. His story remained identical in every significant detail to what he'd told Dr. Voss. The nurses, the paramedics. Detective Kern's report, filed March 22nd, noted, subject's account is internally consistent and delivered with conviction. Subject shows no indication of deception or confabulation. However, account cannot be corroborated without physical evidence of second party. That evidence would be the focus of the next phase. Because while Ethan Hayes' story never changed, the mine itself was about to tell a very different one. The forensic team arrived at the sunken Sparrow Mine entrance on October 19th at 6:47 a.m. 3 investigators from the county sheriff's department, 2 forensic specialists from the state crime lab, and a structural engineer who'd spent 20 years mapping abandoned mines. Their objective was straightforward: document everything, collect every trace, and determine whether a second person had occupied those tunnels. The descent took 43 minutes. They carried LED array lights, evidence collection kits, 3-dimensional mapping equipment, and 17 evidence bags. By 7:30 a.m., they'd reached the chamber where Ethan Hayes had survived for 9 months. What they found was a study in solitary desperation. The camp occupied a natural alcove approximately 8 feet wide and 12 feet deep. Ethan had arranged stones in a rough circle around a central area where his emergency blanket lay, still partially folded. His backpack rested against the northern wall, contents cataloged. Later, empty water bottles, torn packaging from energy bars consumed months earlier, a dead headlamp, a knife with a blade worn thin from use. Near the underground pool, investigators found a collection of 23 flat stones arranged as a crude calendar, one stone apparently moved each day. The forensic team spent 11 hours in that chamber. They photographed every surface. They collected soil samples from 6 different locations. They dusted 7 distinct areas for fingerprints. They swabbed rock surfaces, fabric, and the perimeter of the pool for DNA evidence. They documented every footprint in the softer soil near the water source, creating plaster casts of 37 distinct impressions. Every footprint matched Ethan Hayes' hiking boots. Size 11. Basque St. Elias model. The same boots he'd been wearing when extracted. The wear patterns, the tread damage, the distinctive nick in the left heel, all identical. No other shoe prints, no boot impressions, no evidence of bare feet. Nothing. The structural engineer, Marcus Yee, had mapped over 200 abandoned mines during his career. He told investigators he'd never seen a campsite that looked more definitively with single occupancy. No secondary sleeping area. No division of space suggesting 2 people sharing territory. No arrangement of belongings indicating collaboration or companionship. The DNA analysis returned 3 weeks later. Blood type O positive, consistent with Ethan Hayes, found on the emergency blanket, where he'd apparently treated small cuts and abrasions. Skin cells on the backpack straps, the knife handle, the water bottles, all his. The swabs from the pool perimeter, from the alcove walls, from every surface they'd tested. Single source, DNA, 1 person, 1 survivor. The fingerprint analysis was equally unambiguous. Ethan's prints on the knife, the water bottles, the backpack zippers, the LED flashlight he'd carried, his palm print on the flat rock he'd apparently used to crack open some kind of mineral deposit, his thumbprint on the inside of his empty first aid kit. Nowhere in that chamber did they find evidence of a second person's touch. Investigators expanded their search beyond the immediate camp. They explored every accessible tunnel within a quarter-mile radius, mapping as they went. They found 3 additional chambers large enough for human habitation, all empty, no fire pits, no trash, no water storage, no bedding, no tools, no indication that anyone beyond Ethan Hayes had occupied this section of the mine in recent history. The county sheriff, Linda Gorman, reviewed the forensic report on November 8th. Her statement to the press was measured but definitive. We found no physical evidence suggesting a second individual was present in the sunken Sparrow mine during Mr. Hayes' time there. The investigation indicates he survived alone. But forensic absence isn't the same as proof of impossibility. The mine network extended far beyond the mapped sections. Yee's structural assessment identified at least 7 unmapped passages leading deeper into the mountain, some potentially connecting to other abandoned shafts from different eras. Several tunnels had partially collapsed, creating barriers the forensic team couldn't safely pass. Ground-penetrating radar suggested additional chambers at depths they hadn't reached. If someone had wanted to hide, to move through those tunnels ahead of investigators, to retreat into unmapped darkness, the mine could have swallowed them completely. Yee acknowledged this in his formal report. While we found no evidence of a second occupant in the accessible areas, I cannot certify that no one else was present in the deeper, unmapped sections. The Sunken Sparrow connects to at least 3 other historical mining operations. A person with knowledge of these tunnels could potentially move through them and avoid detection. The forensic team also couldn't explain several details. Ethan's camp showed signs of organization that seemed inconsistent with 9 months of desperate survival. His belongings, though minimal, were arranged with a logic that suggested maintenance of mental clarity. The stone calendar had been kept with remarkable consistency. Water bottles were lined up neatly. The knife, despite heavy use, had been maintained. And then there was the biological puzzle. 3 medical professionals who reviewed Ethan's case independently reached the same conclusion. Survival under those conditions for 9 months should not have been possible. The human body, deprived of adequate nutrition, should have deteriorated past the point of consciousness long before rescue. Ethan's survival suggested either an extraordinary constitution or access to resources investigators hadn't identified. The mine's water source tested positive for trace minerals, but was otherwise unremarkable. The forensic botanist found evidence of 2 varieties of cave-adapted fungi growing in the deeper chambers, both technically edible, but neither providing substantial nutrition. Small arthropods, cave beetles, and blind millipedes inhabited the tunnels, also technically consumable, but inadequate for long-term sustenance. Yet Ethan Hayes had lived. The evidence spoke clearly. No second person. But evidence also has limits. It documents what happened, not necessarily what was experienced. It records physical traces, not subjective reality. Sheriff Gorman closed the case file on November 15th. Official conclusion: Ethan Hayes survived alone in extreme conditions through a combination of available resources, exceptional resilience, and circumstances not fully understood. No evidence supported his account of a companion named Silas. The forensic report was absolute. The physical evidence was conclusive. The scientific reality was documented. Ethan Hayes, reading the findings from his hospital bed, said only, "They didn't go deep enough." Dr. Cassandra Pierce had studied isolation psychology for 17 years. When the Hayes case reached her desk at the university's Department of Behavioral Medicine, she recognized the pattern immediately, not because it was common, but because it was documented. The third man factor, she explained during her consultation with investigators on November 19th. It's a well-established phenomenon in survival psychology. People in extreme situations, trapped climbers, lost explorers, shipwreck survivors, report sensing a presence with them, sometimes a voice, sometimes a full apparition. Always helpful, always encouraging survival. The literature supported her. Sir Ernest Shackleton, during his 1916 Antarctic expedition, reported feeling an unseen presence accompanying his party across South Georgia Island. He wrote that all 3 men in his group felt certain there was a 4th person with them. T.S. Eliot referenced this experience in The Wasteland. Who is the third who walks always beside you? The phenomenon had been studied, categorized, and partially explained. Dr. Pierce cited 23 documented cases in the past century alone. Mountain climbers on Everest reporting a companion during their descent. Sailors adrift for weeks describing a presence that kept them fighting. Solo pilots in distress, hearing a calm voice giving instructions. The human brain, Dr. Pierce continued, will do remarkable things to preserve itself. When faced with death by isolation, starvation, and sensory deprivation, the mind can construct a companion. A hallucination, yes, but a functional one. A survival mechanism. The psychology was sound. Ethan Hayes had spent 9 months in near-total darkness, with minimal food, facing certain death. His mind, desperate and deteriorating, could have created Silas as a psychological anchor, an external voice of encouragement when his own had failed, a reason to keep moving when every physical impulse said to stop. Dr. Pierce analyzed Ethan's description of Silas point by point. Yeah, the old man appeared during Ethan's most desperate moments. He brought water when Ethan was too weak to fetch it himself. He encouraged eating the cave fungi when Ethan had nearly given up. He vanished for days, then returned precisely when Ethan's morale collapsed. Classic protective hallucination, Dr. Pierce noted. Silas wasn't helping Ethan survive. Silas was Ethan's survival instinct, externalized. His own will to live, given form and voice because he couldn't access it directly anymore. The timing fit perfectly. Ethan had maintained relative stability for the first 6 weeks. His initial supplies lasting, his hope of rescue still viable, his psychological resilience intact. Silas appeared, according to Ethan's account, in week 7, right when hope should have died, right when a human mind, isolated and starving, would need intervention most desperately. The medical team treating Ethan documented additional evidence supporting the hallucination theory. His cognitive function tests showed damage consistent with prolonged malnutrition and sensory deprivation. MRI scans revealed changes in brain activity in regions associated with social cognition and face recognition, areas that, in isolation, can begin creating phantom social interactions. Dr. Gerald Moss, the neurologist who examined Ethan on November 3rd, found the scans particularly revealing. The temporoparietal junction, the region that helps us distinguish self from other, showed unusual activation patterns. In extreme isolation, this area can essentially misfire, creating the sensation of another presence. The brain is trying to maintain social cognition, even when there's no one to be social with. The human brain evolved for tribal living, for constant social interaction, for community. Isolate that brain completely, starve it of both nutrition and human contact, subject it to unending darkness and the certainty of death, and it will rebel. It will create what it needs. Silas, in this framework, was mercy, a psychological defense against the horror of dying alone. Ethan's subconscious mind, recognizing that solitary death would break him, constructed a companion, someone to talk to, someone to justify continuing the unbearable work of survival, someone to share the darkness. The description of Silas himself supported the theory. Ethan remembered him as calm, knowledgeable, encouraging, exactly the personality traits he would need from a companion in that situation. Silas never panicked, never despaired, never suggested giving up. He was, essentially, the idealized survival partner. Even Silas's physical appearance fit the pattern. Ethan described him as old but vigorous, weathered but capable, dressed in clothes that seemed wrong for the era but hard to define clearly. When pressed for details, Ethan's descriptions became vague. He couldn't remember specific facial features, couldn't recall exact conversations. The memories had the quality of dreams, emotionally vivid, but factually indistinct. Memory consolidation requires adequate nutrition, Dr. Moss explained. Ethan's brain was cannibalizing itself for energy. His hippocampus, critical for forming new memories, was compromised. He remembers Silas emotionally, the way we remember dreams. Strong feelings, unclear details. That's consistent with hallucination, not actual interaction. The psychological community largely agreed. Dr. Pierce's assessment was peer-reviewed and published in the Journal of Survival Psychology in February. Her conclusion was unambiguous. Ethan Hayes had experienced a documented, well-understood phenomenon. His mind, confronted with unbearable isolation, had created a companion to preserve sanity and enable survival. The explanation was elegant, evidence-based, supported by decades of research and multiple confirmed cases. It answered every question cleanly, except it didn't account for the fungi. The forensic botanist's report, buried in appendix materials most reviewers didn't examine closely, noted something peculiar. The edible fungi Ethan had consumed grew in 3 specific chambers, none adjacent to his main camp. 2 were accessible only through partially collapsed tunnels, requiring difficult navigation. The 3rd was nearly a quarter-mile away through a maze of intersecting passages. Ethan, by his own admission, had initially tried random fungi and became violently ill. He'd nearly died from that mistake in his 2nd month. After that, he'd only eaten the fungi Silas showed him. The botanist confirmed. The 3 varieties Ethan had consumed were the only non-toxic species in that section of mine. The others, 7 different species found throughout the tunnels, ranged from mildly toxic to potentially fatal. Dr. Pierce, when asked about this detail, maintained her position. He learned through trial and error. The memory of nearly dying created a strong aversion. He became more selective. He associated certain locations with safety because those were the places where he didn't get sick. The mind creates narratives to explain our choices. Silas was that narrative. But Ethan's physical condition suggested he couldn't have afforded many toxic mistakes. One near-fatal poisoning, perhaps. Not the multiple trials necessary to eliminate 7 toxic species and identify 3 safe ones through pure experimentation. The water source presented another minor puzzle. Ethan's camp was positioned exactly 15 feet from the underground pool, close enough for easy access, far enough that humidity didn't create excessive mold on his bedding. The positioning showed judgment, planning, an understanding of the space that seemed advanced for someone stumbling through darkness in desperation. Small details, explainable perhaps, but they accumulated at the edges of the official psychological assessment, like water collecting in corners. Dr. Pierce's conclusion stood. Ethan Hayes had survived through extraordinary resilience and a well-documented psychological phenomenon. Silas was a hallucination, a mercy, a survival mechanism that had saved Ethan's life by keeping his mind intact long enough for rescue to arrive. The explanation satisfied investigators, medical professionals, and the scientific community. Ethan Hayes, reading the psychological assessment in his hospital room, set it down without comment. His only response, delivered to the nurse who asked if he understood the doctor's conclusions. Silas knew things I didn't. He knew the tunnels. He knew the water. He knew what to eat. A pause, then quieter. He knew my name before I told him. The forensic sweep found no trace of Silas. No footprints beyond Ethan's. No DNA. No camp. But the sunken Sparrow mine wasn't fully mapped. Over 6 miles of branching passages descended through limestone and granite, only a fraction documented before operations ceased in 1887. The tunnels Ethan occupied represented perhaps 30% of the known system. The rest remained uncharted darkness. Could someone live there? Could they evade detection? Mining historian Dr. Claire Pemberton reviewed the site survey. Her assessment included a detail that complicated the official narrative. The mine had at least 3 historically documented exits. The main shaft where Ethan was found, a collapsed ventilation tunnel 2 miles northwest, and a third outlet, referenced in an 1891 surveyor's log, whose location had never been confirmed. If that exit remained passable, someone could enter and leave without using the primary access point that searchers had monitored, the Serpent's Backbone. Wilderness had a documented history of off-grid inhabitants. Between 2003 and 2018, park rangers encountered 4 separate individuals living in remote areas, some for years before discovery. One man had occupied a natural cave system for 6 years, undetected. The territory was vast enough to hide people who wanted to disappear. Detective Morris reviewed this possibility. If Silas existed, who was he? A fugitive? Someone with outstanding warrants could have reason to avoid authorities, to help a dying man, but refuse rescue. A hermit with severe social isolation wouldn't be the first to choose abandoned mines over human contact. The mine's water source, a seep that fed Ethan's pool, could support 2 people. The fungi he described matched species documented in similar cave systems throughout the region, technically edible, though nutritionally minimal. Survival would be brutal, but theoretically sustainable for someone acclimated over years rather than months. Yet the forensic team found nothing. Ethan Hayes spent 4 months in rehabilitation. He regained 43 pounds. Muscle mass returned slowly. The psychological evaluation, conducted by Dr. Amanda Reeves at Boulder's psychiatric facility, noted acute stress response, symptoms consistent with prolonged trauma, but no evidence of psychosis or delusional disorder. His cognitive function tested within normal ranges. His memory remained precise regarding timeline, details, physical descriptions. He described Silas with unwavering consistency across 14 separate interviews. Same height, same voice, same gray beard and weathered hands. When investigators suggested the hallucination theory, Ethan became visibly agitated. I know what I saw. I know who kept me alive. The guilt consumed him more than the physical recovery. He told his sister he'd abandoned someone who'd saved his life. He requested permission to return to the mine. Denied by both family and authorities, he contacted private investigators about funding. Another search. All declined. The sheriff's department closed the case on March 3rd. Final report concluded Ethan Hayes was the sole occupant of the sunken Sparrow mine during his 9-month ordeal. Claims of a companion were unsubstantiated, attributed to severe psychological distress and survival-induced hallucination. No evidence supported the existence of a second individual. Case status: resolved. No further investigation warranted. Ethan rejected this conclusion entirely. In his only public statement, given to a local newspaper in April, he said, "They found me because Silas told me which tunnel led up. He said rescuers would come soon, that I needed to stay near the water where sound carried. He was right. He saved my life, and everyone wants to pretend he didn't exist." 3 prevailing theories remain. Silas was a powerful psychological construct, the third man factor personified. Or Silas was real, someone living in those tunnels who helped Ethan, then disappeared deeper into unmapped passages. Or something else entirely, something the evidence and expertise can't adequately explain. The mine remains sealed. Ethan Hayes' survival defies medical explanation. His rescue raises more questions than it answers. 3 theories remain. Silas was a protective hallucination, a documented survival mechanism that gave form to Ethan's will to live. Or Silas was real, a fugitive, a hermit who slipped deeper into unmapped tunnels before investigators arrived, choosing to remain invisible. Or something else entirely, something that belongs to folklore whispered around campfires about miners who descended and never emerged. The sunken Sparrow mine has been sealed, the case file closed, but Ethan Hayes still carries the weight of those 9 months and the memory of a man no one else believes existed. Someone kept him alive in absolute darkness. Whether that someone was himself, a stranger, or something the wilderness created to fill its own silence, we may never know. But his story deserves to be remembered, because the truth is still down there, waiting in the dark.